I had an arranged marriage. My father-in-law is a successful president who runs several supermarkets. My mother-in-law is quirky and taciturn. The miscarriage led to a cooling relationship between my husband and me and his affair. The quirky mother-in-law saved me when I was devastated. My name is Sarah. I'm 33 years old. I married 10 years ago and have been living with my husband's parents and my husband. We don't have children. My husband, Brad, and I were married through an arranged marriage. At that time, I was living with my parents and brother, a family of 4. My family has lived in the area for generations. And my father was the president of the neighborhood association. As a result, we often had requests for help or advice. One day, a so-called matchmaker lady, who enjoys connecting men and women, came to consult us. It's something you don't hear much about these days. She was looking for a bride for the only son of a local supermarket chain owner. I was serving coffee and snacks, thinking it was none of my business. So I was surprised when my father suddenly turned to me and said, "Hey, Sarah. How about you try meeting him?" Indeed, I had never dated a man, and after graduating from community college, I didn't find a job but helped with household chores instead. That was because the household chores were too much for my mother alone due to the frequent visitors. I learned various household tasks, including cooking, thoroughly from my mother. My hobbies are cooking, reading, and handicrafts. Being an indoor, plain, and shy girl. My father might have been worried that it would be difficult for me to meet men in the future. The son of the supermarket founder who owns several stores, right? He's 30 years old, isn't that a good match? Why don't you meet him at least? He's quite a good man. He showed me a matchmaking photo. Nowadays, they call it a dating profile picture. Indeed, the photo looked sincere and likable. More importantly, he resembled my favorite actor. Even the matchmaker lady said Sarah would be perfect for him. A great match. Without listening to my opinion, she half forced me to go to a photo studio to take a matchmaking photo. I tried to say, but she interrupted. If you don't like it, you can refuse after meeting him, making me feel pressured to comply. Even my mother said, "It's fine. If you don't like it, I'll refuse for you. Go have some delicious food." And she took me shopping for a new dress at the department store. You really don't care about men or makeup. Your father is worried about you, she told me. The following year, it was decided that my father would retire as the president of the neighborhood association and my brother would get married and his bride would live with us. My parents were worried that I would have no place in our home. They thought it would be better for someone like me to marry and be happy. On the day of the meeting, I had my hair done at the salon, got my makeup done, and wore the dress my mother and I chose. I looked like a different person. "You look much more beautiful than in the photo," said the matchmaking partner, Brad, who resembled Bradley Cooper. It's unfair to even have a similar name. The matchmaker lady was rapidly introducing us, but I hardly listened. Then I heard, "You two make a wonderful couple," for the first time. I didn't know people really said that, I said, surprised. Well, I don't think it's said much nowadays. She's an old-fashioned matchmaker. Brad laughed. His smile was charming. And I wondered why such a man would choose to marry through an arranged meeting. Perhaps it showed on my face because Brad explained. That lady is a childhood friend of my father. Knowing I was 30 and still unmarried, she nagged about arranging a meeting. My father said it was just to fulfill a duty once. But I'm glad I came because you are a wonderful person. Hearing that, I couldn't help but say, "Me too." It was a bit frustrating to go along with the matchmaker's plan. But Brad and I decided to get married. The wedding and reception were grand, with many guests invited. And our honeymoon was in Europe. Life at my new home began after a whirlwind of dreamlike days. My father-in-law was a robust, cheerful man who seemed dependable. My mother-in-law was taciturn, rarely spoke, and often kept to her room. I was surprised to learn that it's common for a housewife to have her own room in such a large house. I was also surprised when my mother-in-law told me right after I moved in, "I'm not good at household chores, so I'll leave them to you. We have a cleaning service come twice a week." I had assumed that after getting married, I would be meticulously instructed by my mother-in-law on how to cook and clean, according to the ways of their house. True to her word, my mother-in-law never interfered with the household chores. She ate the meals I prepared without a single complaint, and would retreat to her room after finishing her meal. I didn't feel disliked because occasionally, around 3 p.m., she would make tea and we would enjoy delicious sweets she ordered, just the two of us. Tea should be made with boiling water. Wait until the tea leaves fully open. The tea she made was very fragrant and delicious. Usually quiet, my mother-in-law would talk quite a bit during these times. "What do you usually do in your room, mother?" I dared to ask her. "I do some research on the computer, read books, and watch movies." She was a completely different type of person from my mother, who was always busy taking care of others and doing household chores. "Do you think it's luxurious for a housewife to have her own room?" It was as if she read my mind and asked me. "It used to be my husband's room, but he's a bit of a loner and said he had nothing to do by himself in his room, so he was always in the living room. So, I decided to take it over." She smiled kindly as she said this, making me grow fond of my somewhat quirky mother-in-law. A year into our calm and happy marriage, I became pregnant. My husband, in-laws, and my own family were delighted, probably marking the happiest time of my life. However, shortly after sharing the news with everyone, I miscarried. The doctor said early miscarriages are common and not to worry too much as I was still young. My husband, in-laws, and my family comforted me, but I was deeply shocked. I had thought it was natural for a married woman to get pregnant and have children. It was only when I found myself in this situation that I learned some couples can't have children. And there are many problems with pregnancy and childbirth. "I'm sorry, father, mother." I apologized them. "Why are you apologizing? You're the one who's suffering the most," my mother-in-law said, embracing me with kindness that felt like salvation. I saw many stories online and in magazines about women who had successful pregnancies after miscarriages. So, I thought it would be okay for me too. I believed I would get pregnant again soon. But time passed, and I struggled to conceive, growing more anxious. Looking back, I think I became obsessed with getting pregnant. I wanted to make up for my failure, not to be called a defective wife who couldn't have children. I was driven by these ugly emotions. It's no wonder my husband began to avoid our conjugal duties, which had become an obligation. I never imagined he would have an affair. I didn't suspect anything when I found a receipt from an expensive restaurant in his suit pocket, or even when I found an earring in his car that clearly wasn't mine. I noticed he was frequently texting someone, but I couldn't bring myself to voice my suspicions. Around that time, my father-in-law suffered a stroke. He survived but was left with paralysis on one side of his body and had to retire from work. My husband took over as president of the company. For a while, he held the title of acting president. My mother-in-law and I were left to care for my father-in-law at home. "If it weren't for you, Sarah, we would have had to put him in a facility." While saying that, my mother-in-law was diligently caring for him. At that moment, I felt that there was love between this couple. In contrast, what about us, my husband and me? After 10 years of marriage, we now sleep in separate bedrooms. And we hardly even talk, let alone have a marital relationship. Since my husband took over as president, he has started to stay out more often, citing his busy schedule. When he does come home, he complains. This house is so gloomy. A father with half-body paralysis, a weird mother, and a gloomy wife, it's just uncomfortable. Recently, I became certain that my husband was having an affair. He doesn't even try to hide it, openly talking to the other woman on the phone at home. He pretends it's a business call, but it's obvious from his expression that it's not. Where did I go wrong? If only I hadn't miscarried. I know it's useless to think like that now. But was it wrong to become so desperate to get pregnant afterward? Was it wrong not to confront my husband when I first suspected his affair? By the time I realized it, it felt like it was too late to turn things around. One day, I unfolded a piece of paper from the breast pocket of my husband's suit, which he said he wore on a business trip. It was a child's drawing of a father, seemingly done by a child around 4 to 5 years old. I nearly collapsed as darkness seemed to envelop me. The drawing, with "Daddy" written in a childlike letter, deeply hurt me. Hey. What are you doing, snooping around like a thief? My husband entered the room and coldly spoke to me. I see. That kid must have put it there without me knowing. Kids, you know, can't help it. Seeing the paper I was holding, my husband said it without a hint of remorse. You knew, didn't you? That I have another woman. I knew. But I didn't know about the child. The existence of a child he had with someone else devastated me. A child we couldn't have together. Yeah, kids are cute. You're pretty much like a maid now, so it's fine if you leave. I'll pay you a settlement or something. It seemed my husband intended to remarry his affair partner if I divorced him. Since there was already a child involved, maybe that would be better for this family. The next morning, as I was preparing breakfast with swollen eyes from crying, my husband clicked his tongue and left for work without eating. After cooling my swollen face to make it somewhat presentable, I went to see my father-in-law and felt embarrassed when I saw John, who seemed surprised by my appearance. John has been the secretary to my father-in-law. More of a personal secretary than a company one, a man in his mid-40s. I've known him since I married into the family 10 years ago, but I've never seen John laugh. He's always been impeccably polite and unflappable. Then, I will take my leave now. John said this, as usual, bowed, and left. I gathered my courage and shared what I had thought about the night before with my in-laws. There's no need for Sarah to leave. My mother-in-law said this without changing her expression. But it was our son who broke the rules first. You've done nothing wrong. Let's say, it's 8-2. No, 9-1 our son's fault. But we couldn't have children. That doesn't matter. You're a good daughter-in-law. Besides, if you leave, taking care of him by myself would be too hard. I glanced over and saw my father-in-law nodding in agreement. Can I stay in this house? Of course. If you want to leave, I won't stop you. Choose for yourself. Choose for myself. Always being swept along, doing as I was told, and pretending not to notice even when I had something to say, I lived my life. I want to stay here. For the first time, I felt like I could clearly express my own will. 6 months later, my father-in-law suffered another stroke in his sleep and passed away. My mother-in-law did not let her son take charge of the funeral, but remained firm and took on the role herself. My husband dealt with the condolence visitors with a solemn face, but he didn't seem very saddened. A little after my father-in-law's death, I noticed something odd about my mother-in-law. Instead of secluding herself in her room upstairs, she often sat on the living room sofa, staring blankly at the TV. She wouldn't change the channel, just watched whatever was on. Not even laughing at comedy shows. Seeing his mother like this, my husband said, loud enough for her to hear. Dad dies and she goes senile. Great, just great. How can you say that? Aren't you worried? I challenged him, and his response was shocking. Instead of that, you're still here even after Dad's care is no longer needed. What, after the inheritance? I was saddened because I had never thought of such a thing. Then, my mother-in-law tried to go out to the garden, fell at the entrance, and severely sprained her ankle. She needed a wheelchair to move around the house, which was spacious enough to avoid hitting anything. But it wasn't designed with accessibility in mind. I had to lift the wheelchair over small steps, and my husband, upon seeing this after returning from work, did not offer help but said, "A sprain? Now that she can't walk, she'll go even more senile. I'm not dealing with any caregiving, so you're up until the old lady kicks it." That made me snap. What's wrong with you? Is that something a son should say? Yeah. You keep scoring points. I'll give you a bit of the inheritance, so work hard. With that, he left, probably back to his mistress and child. I was so angry and frustrated I felt like crying. Then, suddenly, my mother-in-law burst into laughter. What? Mother? What happened? For a moment, I thought she had really lost her mind. Then, she spoke clearly. Ridiculous. Such a foolish son. I've made up my mind. Let's start by selling the house. What? She pulled out her smartphone from her pocket and called John. As I was bewildered, not understanding what was happening, she said, "Sorry, Sarah. It's true I was feeling down since my husband passed away. But I wasn't going senile. I was just thinking. But, you didn't react at all to the TV. That's because it wasn't interesting." John arrived with documents in hand. Since Brad became acting president, the company's performance has been poor. Not just in sales across stores, but also employee morale has dropped. The main reason is the withdrawal of Hillary and the president from management. But Brad's spending habits are also a significant concern. He showed some data to my mother-in-law. Hillary is her name. What does that mean? I blurted out the question, and John's surprising answer came. The real manager of our company was Hillary. The company grew significantly thanks to the president's popularity and Hillary's management skills. And thanks to you, John. You compensated for what we lacked as a couple. So, the reason you stayed in her room was, I can view all the store data and surveillance camera footage from the computer in my room. It's true I also read books and watched movies. But why? Couldn't you have been the vice president or something? Because I'm not cut out to be a leader. Saying this, my mother-in-law looked off into the distance. I think she saw my late father-in-law in her mind's eye. I've come to understand Brad's true nature and intentions. He's not fit to run the company. I have no intention of passing on the land or the house to him. John, would you like to become the president? Is it really so easy to hand over the role of president? No, I'm like you, I'm not cut out to lead others. That's troublesome. Then, Sarah, you become the president. What? I couldn't understand what she was saying. It's unthinkable for me, with no corporate experience, to suddenly become president. When I said that, don't worry, John will support you. I have a good eye for people. Sarah, you have a charm that makes people want to support you. That's enough to be a president. With your kindness and attention to detail, and the current trend of welcoming female executives, you'll be fine, even John said so. But what about her real son? When I said that, another shocking fact was revealed. That child is not my real son. My in-laws were unable to have children. At a time when infertility treatments were not as advanced as they are now. Infertility was often seen as the woman's fault. And my mother-in-law suffered a lot because of this. In the end, the problem was with my husband. But by the time we found out, I was already over 40. So we adopted a child from a distant relative with many children. Brad was already 5 years old when he came to this house, so he should know. Is that why he can behave so terribly, because he's not their real son? I said I have a good eye for people. But I guess I don't understand children. Oh dear, that means I raised him wrong. My mother-in-law said this with a wry smile. Anyway, Brad is a failure both as a businessman and as a family man. Including evidence of his affairs, John has gathered enough irrefutable evidence. That child will have to leave both the company and this house. I believed that what my mother-in-law said would indeed happen. John, sell this place as soon as possible. I want to live in an apartment, preferably a high-rise. But living in New York at this age seems too much. So the high-rise apartments near the station here will do. Climbing stairs is too much trouble when you're old. Then, the reason you've been in the living room lately is. Part of it is because I stepped back from management. But also because there's only one toilet on the first floor. It's hard when you're old and need the toilet frequently. My mother-in-law said this with a bit of a sulk. I found it somewhat endearing. So? Sarah, will you take the role of president or not? I'll do it. I blurted out my answer without thinking. This might be a big opportunity. A chance to change my personality, my life. On the day of my inauguration as president, my husband, Brad, barged in, furious. What the hell is this? What's going on? I suddenly got a call from John yesterday, went to the house, and it's being demolished. I'm the president, right? This woman being president is some kind of joke. He yelled loudly in front of the employees. You were only ever acting president. Based on the company's performance during your tenure and the feedback from employees. It was judged that the company could not prosper under your leadership. I said this without changing my facial expression. The result of practicing in front of a mirror the night before. And the expensive suits you had tailored. The night spent squandering at high-end clubs. That was all with company money. We could sue you for embezzlement. Surprised and mocking laughter rose from the employees. Damn it. You'll pay for this. Brad, leaving behind a line like a villain from a movie, fled the scene. I apologize for the unpleasant scene. I may not have the knowledge or experience. But I hope to make this a better company with your support. Please, lend me your strength. As I bowed, warm applause filled the room. When I left the venue, my husband was waiting outside. Hey. What's the joke here? What happened to the house? That house and this company are mine, right? Or they would be once the old lady kicks the bucket. Violence is not the answer. As my husband grabbed me by the collar and yelled, John twisted his arm and intervened. Ouch. Let go. What do you think you're doing? You're just a secretary. Even an Amir secretary is far more capable than a former foolish son. My mother-in-law, having recovered from her sprain, walked up firmly on her own and spoke. The house and land have already been sold. And there's no place for you in this company. You've been my son for a long time, so you'll get your legal share of the inheritance. Use that money to start over somewhere else. Inspired by my mother-in-law's assertive demeanor, I said, here's the divorce papers. I thrust the divorce documents at him. And then John added one last thing. Oh, by the way, it seems that the child of your mistress is not your son. Perhaps you should check? What? No way. That's not possible. Leaving my stunned ex-husband behind, we left the scene. Later, I heard from John that after confronting his mistress, she readily confessed, and he kicked her out. John told me that my ex-husband, now alone, was spending his days drowned in alcohol despite having received an inheritance that could have opened a new store. Hearing this from John, I felt no sympathy at all. The view from the top floor is really something, isn't it? Looking out at the night view from the large windows of our new high-rise apartment, my mother-in-law spoke. The apartment had commercial facilities on the first and second floors, including a supermarket, bookstore, flower shop, hospital, and even a veterinary clinic. By the way, the supermarket is a slightly upscale one that we have newly launched. It would be perfect if Sarah and John ended up together. Then I'd have no regrets. Once again, my mother-in-law mentioned something outrageous. Oh, Hillary. Things don't always go as you say. Right, John? Indeed, Hillary. Really, you're too much. I'm already 45, and Sarah is just 35. Looking at John, who had turned a bit red, mother-in-law pressed on. Oh, come on. A 10-year difference is nothing. Your father and I had about the same gap. John, you've always been concerned about Sarah whenever you came over. That was because Brad's behavior was just too terrible. Seeing John flustered like that for the first time was a new experience. 3 years later, much to my chagrin, or rather, to my delight, my mother-in-law's predictions came true. I said I'd have no regrets, but I ended up having one. I got to see my grandchild's face. Saying so, my mother-in-law lifted a newborn girl into her arms. Though technically, the baby isn't related by blood. Now my husband, John, added something unnecessary. That doesn't matter at all. You and Sarah are my precious son and daughter. Holding her granddaughter, my mother-in-law smiled warmly. I was truly glad to have met her. In my heart, I deeply felt this.